Now let's go ahead and configure authorization. So I want to, now when the user connects, I want to grant him privilege level 15 because currently the user doesn't have, let's say, doesn't have access to all commands from user mode. It was assigned privilege level of 1, which means it had access to only restricted set of commands. So I'm gonna go on router tree now and say conf t and define my authorization exec. AA authorization exec, and I'm gonna say do show run include AAA. Let's use the same naming convention. I'm gonna say AA authorization exec, and then I'm gonna say VTI exec authorization group TACACS plus local. So as you can see on both the authentication list and the authorization list, I'm defining two methods, TACACS plus first and local second. Which what that means that for both of them, if I fail to speak with the TACACS server because it's down or has a problem, it has rebooted, then I'm going to fall back to local authentication and authorization. Of course, assuming I have locally configured a username and password, which I have. So then because at this point, if I tell it in again from router 1 to router 3 and use the same TACACS user and password, nothing happened because I need to also configure the TACACS server to provide exec authorization, which means to change the privilege level of the user, exit. So let's go on the ACA server and define a policy that I want the TACACS server to return also a privilege level to the authenticated user of TACACS. So I'm going to go under policy elements to define that specific policy. I'm going to go to device administration. I'm going to say shell profiles because I want as the user gets access to the shell, I want to grant him a specific privilege level. I'm going to say create. Give it a name of, let's say, just priv level authorization, because that's what I want to do. Here's privilege level. Common tasks. You're going to configure default privilege level to be, let's say, static, and let's put in here a 5, and maximum of static of 15. So the default one is going to be assigned as the user logs in, and the maximum one is what is the maximum level that the user can get assigned if he's going to use the enable method. So by using this configuration, it means that the user, once he's going to connect now, he should be assigned a level of 5. Submit. But this is just a policy which has to be applied. So if I want this to be enforced, I go to my access policies and to default device admin, authorization, and I create a new rule, which I just name it authorization, or whatever, authorization. Of course, in general, we're going to give more meaningful names, authorization. And I'm going to say select okay. I need to configure at least one condition. Let's say that, so in order to assign this privilege, this shell profile to a specific user as being connected, that's the result. You have to put in minimum one condition. And I'm going to say in my case, if identity group in not that condition, let me put if network device group. So I'm going to say that if the network device group is in all locations. So when you have defined the when I have configured router 3 as a network access device on the ACA server, I could have optionally configured also location. So the TACAC server, the ACA server, like also the ICE server, allows for very fine granular control. Like you can put a lot of conditions, and if those conditions are matched for a specific session, then you can select which authorization to assign. In my case, I'm not being specific, it's just for the sake of the example. I'm going to say OK and save changes. So at this point, if I'm going to connect again, but of course I forgot to do one thing on the router. I have defined the authorization exec list, but because I'm using a non-default list, it has to likewise be applied at the VTN lines. Otherwise, it's not going to be enforced. So you go in here and say authorization exec. There we go. So now if I telnet again from router 1 to router 3 and I authenticate, I should be granted privilege level of 6. Of 5, sorry, not at 6. There we go. If I want to get access to 15, because only privilege level 15 allows me to have access to all commands, including conft, so configure terminal to configure the router, then I have to configure the enable method in here. So I want to say for those users that have not been by default granted access to privilege level 15, if they have to use the enable authentication method to get access to a higher privilege level. So let's define that list. Now, because of the enable list uses, the enable list cannot make use of a name list, but at the default list. It means as soon as I type in this command, this is also going to apply for the console access. And I don't want that. So let me make sure that at the console, I'm going to locally override so that console access is going to have a level of 15 by default, because otherwise it's a level of 1. Because without this command, if I configure this policy in here and I accidentally log out of the console, when I come back in, it's going to put me in user mode, and I will need to use the enable command to get access to configure mode. And I don't want that in this use case. So let's put the command again, AAA authentication, enable default group TACACS, and of course with the fallback on the local enable password. And we'll speak about that in a couple as well. So it means that now if I'm going to say enable, which if I don't put any number, it means by default enable 15. So enable enter equals enable 15. I'm going to put in here the enable password as defined on the TACACS server, which by default is the same as the user password. So TACACS. And because on the TACACS server I have configured the maximum privilege level allowed to be 15, I should get access to 15. Let me put the proper password. Show privilege. I should be now in 15. And here we go, I am. So I can now go to configure mode and configure router, do whatever I want. So this was the authentication and authorization part. But I have done only authorization for exec, not for commands. So at this point, I'm going to be allowed to do whatever I want on the router. All commands are accessible to me because I have privilege level 15, which is the highest privilege level, which gets me access to all commands. But now, so in general, what you're going to do is you're going to give to all of your users privilege level 15, but which technically speaking, then they have all of the commands available. But then you're going to also implement command authorization, because you would want different groups of users to be able to perform only specific actions on the devices. So there's no catch in here, but the confusion is the following, and you have to not make that confusion. It's one thing to be assigned a level of 15, which gets me access to all commands. But then if I configure command authorization, it means that it doesn't matter if the command is accessible to me. It matters if the TACAC server allows me to type in that command. So I'm going to have privilege level 15 on all of my users. So they're going to have, technically speaking, access to all commands. But then each command they type in, the router is going to ask the TACAC server, is this user allowed to type in this command, yes or no? So like in here, as I am being connected from router 1 to router 3 via a telnet session, I have been assigned a level of 15 by the ACS server. I've been authorized to level 15, which means I have access to all commands. But now I'm going to go on router 3 and configure command authorization. So what's going to happen is I'm going to type in here a command of, let's say, conft, for example, configure terminal. Then router 3 is going to query at that point lively the ACA server via TACAX. It's going to lively query the TACAX server and it's going to say, is the user of TACAX, because I'm authenticated with the user of TACAX, is the user of TACAX allowed to type in this command, yes or no? So for this to happen, I gotta go on the router and first configure authorization for commands. Let's go to router 3 and say AAA authorization commands, and for which privilege level, let's say only 15. I want the router to ask the TACAC server if a specific user is allowed to type in any privilege level 15 commands. Commands 15, and I'm going to say VTI, let's use the same name, VTI command authorization. VTI command 15 authorization. Default that was the name of the list, group TACAX plus local. And by default with this configuration, I'm going to ask the TACAX server only for privilege level commands. So when a user is going to get connected to the router remotely, which is like the case of router 1, of course, assuming the authorization list is applied on the VTI lines. So authorization commands 15 and this list. So now all users connected to the VTI lines, when they want to type in any level 15 commands, the router is going to ask the TACAC server, is this user allowed to type in this 15 level command? But by default, it's going to do this only for user mode level 15 commands, not for configure mode. So if you want any configure mode commands of level 15 to be authorized against TACAC server, you gotta say AAA authorization config commands. So I have done everything which was required on the router. Now let's go on the TACAC server and configure a set of commands which is going to be allowed to that user. So let's go on the TACAC server and let's go get it under policy elements, under device administration, command sets, and I want to grant the user access to specific commands. So I want to allow the user to, let's say, configure router rip, version of the router rip, and let's say configure also the enable router rip on specific interfaces. So I'm going to say, so now for the user to get access to configure router rip, let's give the command set a name. It's going to be TACAX user set. I'm going to say permit. I'm going to check this box, permit any command. I want that to be disabled, That command, that checkbox says permit any command that's not in the table below. I don't want that. I want to permit only commands that I'm going to put manually in here. So I'm going to say I want to give access permit to the command of configure in the arguments terminal. So this is a 15 level command which has to be allowed to the user in order to actually be granted access to router web command. So first the user has to be able to type in configure terminal, then has to be able to type in router web, then has to be able to type version, let's do it, let's look again in there, has to be able to type in version, and also network state, network commands to enable the protocol on specific interfaces, network, and say add. And pretty much that's it. And let's make sure he can also say use the exit command, add. That's a privilege level 0 command. I don't need that, delete, and say submit. So I have defined the set of commands which the user should be allowed to use. Then I gotta of course apply that to my authorization policy. I first need to make it available. You go under customize in here and you make the command sets available as a result to a authorization policy. You say OK. You say save changes. And then you click on your existing rule. Okay, let's name it appropriate authorization. And then you add, as a result of this authorization, your set of commands. Okay. And you say save changes. So at this point, let's verify that up. So I should be able, at this point, if my configuration is correct. Let's go on router 1, which is the connected session via telnet to router 3. So I should be able to say configure terminal. Should be able to say router rep, version 2, network my loopback. But I should not be able to use passive interface command, for example. And there we go, I'm not allowed to use that command. Or I should not be able to configure the loopback, because I have not been authorized for that command. So there we go, my authorization works. To confirm that, you go again on the ACS server, you go under monitoring and reports, and you go on catalog, and I think it's a protocol, and let's look at TACACS authorization. And there we go in here. What is of course with green was allowed, with red was disallowed. So there we go, the configure terminal command in here was allowed, router rep was allowed, version 2 was allowed, network was allowed, but then interface loopback 0 and the passivizing on the router rep was not allowed, as expected based on my configuration. And the last thing to do is clearly to go and configure command accounting, because you would want to account for which user has done what on the router. So then you say AAA accounting command, and you say for 15, I want to count for level 15 commands only, let's say. Of course, in general, what you would want to do if you don't change the privilege level of any commands on the router, which by default any commands are going to have a level of 1 or 15, then in general you're going to always configure authorization and accounting for both privilege level 1 and 15, because all commands will be accessible to one of those two privilege levels by default in case you haven't changed the level of a command.